Good evening, everyone. I think we're ready to get started. Thanks for joining us tonight. Welcome to Sleeping Soundly, Why Catching Z's Matters for Kids. And we're really glad that you've joined us this evening. I want to start by saying that the University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we're located on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. We have a few housekeeping items just before we get started. The lecture tonight will be about 40 minutes, and there'll be about 20 minutes for questions after that. And this microphone and one other will be available to be passed around during the Q&A. So just raise your hand and we will come to you. And for those joining us online, please ask any questions you have by typing them into the chat box. And so at this time, I really want to welcome our online audience. And in particular, we're really excited to have about 20 School of Public Health alumni joining us in Calgary. So we're excited that our alumni chapter has arranged this and they're hosting a group. And we're glad that you're part of the event tonight. Second housekeeping item, photographs and video recordings of the event will be taken. And the personal information which is being recorded is collected under the authority of Section 33C of the Alberta Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, and will be protected under Part 2 of that Act. And we gather it, and it will be used for educational and promotional purposes by the school. When you came in, or as you approached the room, there were event evaluation forms being passed out. We'd really appreciate it if you take 2 minutes to fill those out and leave them with us at the door on the way out. We encourage you to fill them out. It helps us know how you valued the event and allows us to be in contact with you for future events if you decide to leave that information. If you happen to be on social media, whether you're in the room or online, we invite you to join the conversation online using the hashtag that you see on the screen, which is TIPH Lecture. I also want to let you know that it's our tradition to have a reception in the hallway following the lecture, and our speaker will be available for questions and discussion and to get acquainted with you during that time. So now I'd like to pass the mic to Dr. Jeff Johnson, our Associate Dean Education, and he will introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Donna. Good evening, and I'd also like to give my welcome. I'm pleased to have you join us in the room and those of you online in Calgary. This event, the TIPH lecture, is the 6th installment of the public lecture series. These lectures are intended to share information so we can all learn and think critically about public health issues that affect people locally as well as globally. Public health, as you may know, aims to prevent injury and illness and protect and promote health and wellness in people in all communities. It crosses multiple fields of studies such as health, social sciences, human sciences, to touch every aspect of life on a daily basis. It affects people of all ages, and tonight we'll focus specifically on children and youth and the specific topic of sleep. Sleep is increasingly recognized as an important aspect or important behavior, if you will, of health and well-being. And yet evidence suggests that 1/4 to 1/3 of our children and adolescents are sleep deprived. Research shows that sleep can have a dramatic effect on a child's health, on physical, mental, and social well-being. So what can we do about it? What are some of the answers? Tonight we'll learn that perhaps the answers may be in our schools and the concept of comprehensive school health, because that is an aspect of public health. So tonight our speaker will discuss how promoting health at schools may affect health behaviors at home, such as sleep. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kate Storey. Kate is an assistant professor here in the School of Public Health. Her research aims to improve overall health and well-being of families and communities by making the healthy choice the easy choice, whether it's where we live, work, or with children and youth where we learn and play. Through case research, she evaluates the process, the impact, and outcome of school-based health interventions that focus on improving the whole school environment, which includes students' educational outcomes as well as school health. And we're very pleased to say that recently Kate was awarded an award from the Canadian Institute for Health Research to help explore the translation of sleep promotion at school to sleep behaviors at home. So if you can, please join me in welcoming Kate Storey.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, both here in person and virtually. So hello to everyone out there. So it's really nice to see everyone. I know that everyone has very busy schedules, which I'll talk about today. So it's nice to see a lot of familiar faces. So usually when I give a talk, I usually like to start off with a little bit of a disclaimer for those of you that know me. And today my disclaimer is that I am not a sleep researcher. So before you get up and leave the room, I hopefully can explain why you should stay. So I do, in fact, promote healthy sleep behaviors in schools, but I don't study the intricacies of sleep. But what I am an expert on is understanding how children's multiple environments, be it the political, the social, the physical, or the economic environments, influence and impact their health. And I work with school communities all across Canada to do this. So I work with school communities to help create healthy school communities where children live, learn, work, and play, or their families work and play. The second disclaimer is that I'm also extremely curious. This is perhaps where my daughter got all of her curiosity from, but I'm also a community-based researcher. So when the schools that I work with tell me that the kids that they are working with are tired, and that the work that I've done to understand how school-learned health behaviors can translate into home, I listen and I'm curious. So what you have today is a result of both my curiosity and my passion and my advocacy for children's health. So as both a mother of 2 young kids and as a scientist, I'm personally invested in ensuring that all children have the opportunities to grow and thrive, and where every child knows that their voice matters. So wearing both hats today, both as a mom and a school health expert, I'm going to take you on this journey today of looking at children's sleep. So you can see them there. So on this eve of World Sleep Day, what I encourage you to do is to think outside the box. If we can look at children's sleep in the context of unusual suspects, we can look at perhaps the school as a mechanism to promote sleep among children. So this comes up when I talk about promoting sleep in schools, is people say, are you promoting that children sleep in school? So I'm not suggesting that we keep kids up all night and have them sleep all day in school. What I am suggesting is we need to look at ways in order to prevent kids from sleeping in schools. So today what I'm going to be doing is reviewing the current state of children's sleep, some of the implications of inadequate sleep amongst youth, and also look at some solutions. But first, let's start with an image. Putting this image up, I imagine that many of you and children and youth, if we put this up, would start making your heart race. So many of you are probably in this situation right now where your phone is potentially nearly dying and you're looking around the room for a place to plug your phone in. So we do everything in our power to recharge our phone's batteries. In fact, there are plenty of charging stations on planes, on trains, on buses. You can pay good money for a rapid charge. You can also buy a phone case that promises to extend the battery life of your phone. But when is the last time that you thought about recharging your own batteries with the same amount of enthusiasm? The sleep industry is making billions of dollars because, in fact, a third of us are sleep deprived, and even more of us don't have great sleep efficiency, so the ability to go to sleep and stay asleep. An article in Forbes indicated that sleep labs alone are enjoying a 4% growth every year for the last 4 years, and that this industry is expected to reach the $10 billion mark by 2020. And that's just sleep labs alone for those that are diagnosing sleep disorders. That doesn't include books and magazines and sleep manifestos and mattresses and everything else other than sheep that promises you the ability to go to sleep. There's even a book called A Sleep Revolution that promises a sleep manifesto. So when we look at this, and if my focus is on children, why do we care about adults? And what I would say is that adults provide the context of our current reality, and in many ways are shaping the societal perceptions that we have about sleep and well-being, and that is projected to our children. So I'm a visual person, so here's an image. So if we think of the context of our environment, be it social, physical, political, or economic, we have engineered environments that do not promote health. So in public health, we often look at pictures like this, and this is a photograph done by Edward Bertinsky, who's one of Canada's most well-respected photographers and has exhibits all across Canada and worldwide. And we look at the different communities. Now, I should note that this is actually one image. This is not two different pictures. On the left, you can see an image of the Salt River Pima Maricopa community, and on the right is a community within Scottsdale, but it's just divided by a road. So if we're looking at the context of health within our environment, we often look at pictures like this of how difficult it is to be healthy in terms of the context of being socially connected and physically active. It's very difficult in this. But if we look at this in the context of sleep, what does this image tell us about sleep? Aside from potential light and noise pollution, we can also look at this in terms of potentially the American dream. So what goes along with the American dream, and why do we value it at all costs? So this might go with cars, busy schedules, jobs, rushing, being busy, busy, busy. And so when we look at the American dream at all costs, are we actually dreaming in order to achieve this American dream? So here are two more of Edward's photographs. And so which image for you, and these are two separate photographs, allows you to feel calm, still, relaxed, and perhaps rejuvenated? So we have created a society and we've created environments that Dr. Ruben Nyman likes to call being twired. So we are simultaneously tired and wired. So many of us struggle nightly with inadequate sleep. So that leads to just chronic tiredness. We're chronically sleep deprived. Then we have the stimulation of modern life, much like the images that I showed you in terms of what our quote-unquote American dream is. And that creates the persistent wiredness. Then you add caffeine to the equation, and you can see that it's totally a vicious cycle. So what has society become? So I'm not going to play this clip, but I encourage you to do so. And I know I received this video from numerous grad students of mine, especially when I was on maternity leave, saying, "This is you, Kate. You know, there's always a child in the background." But what society has forced us is that we are in some way, we're supposed to have everything together. The more that we get done, the better, and that we truly value perfectionism. So this is Professor Robert Kelly, and he was interrupted during a BBC interview by his kids. But soon after this, there was a comedic portrayal of what would have happened if this was a woman. Now, I'm not going to go into feminism today, although I'd like to, but what happens in this situation is that the mom picks up the baby, or picks up the toddler, gives her milk, then you can see the baby comes in, she gives the baby a toy, cooks a turkey dinner, steams a shirt, cleans the toilet, and finds a missing sock for her husband. So while I think that men probably could have done all of this during a BBC interview, and we're not going to get into feminism, this gives us an idea of the unrealistic expectations that we place on society and what we've created in terms of what adults are projecting. So if we look at kids, as adults, we value and support this perfectionism. More that we get done, the better. And our kids are listening. So this is one example. So kids, children, and youth use social media, as do adults and young adults alike. But within children and youth, this is very popular to use social media. So this is one example is Instagram. So what is this saying? So while the reality is not necessarily having everything together, what is projected is. So again, our kids are listening to what, as adults, we are shaping in the conversations we're having. Now, Donald Trump tweets about everything, so why not sleep? You can see a tweet here. We live in a society of one-upmanship, and sleep is no stranger to that. So there is a sleep one-upmanship going on. We brag about being busy, and we brag about being sleep deprived. And I challenge you to, when is the last time when someone asked you, "Hey, would you like to have a meeting at 8? Maybe it's your boss. My dean is sitting right over there. Q asked me to have a meeting at 8 a.m. When's the last time you said, "You know what, can we make it 9? I really like to sleep in." right? We would never do that. In fact, I listened to a TED Talk by Arianna Huffington, who is the author of the book, The Sleep Revolution, and promises she has a sleep manifesto. And she said that in her talk, she had gone to dinner with a friend who was bragging about only having 4 hours of sleep. And her joke was that she said, "Oh, it's too bad you didn't get 5 hours. This would have been a far more interesting date." Which is very true, right? So we can all imagine that we're not exactly our best selves when we're sleep deprived. You could ask any new parent, or you could ask my husband, because as a result of this talk, I'm a little bit tired myself, so how's that for irony? But we aren't exactly the best versions of ourselves. And we could ask Donald Trump about being the best version of himself, considering he's a well-known person with sleep deprivation, but then we wouldn't have the abilities to discuss the intricacies of the word kafefi, which was, again, a late-night tweet. So our kids are listening, and if they're listening, what is this doing to our children's sleep? Is this actually translating to sleep deprivation amongst our kids? It seems that new studies every day are coming out about sleep in kids and the status of children's sleep. So is this something new, or is this an interesting headline? How are they doing? Are they doing any better than us as adults? Or are they taking note of the society that we as adults have helped to create? So they're not doing any better. Let's take a look at this image here. So while that poor unlucky kid missed his photo op with President Obama due to sleeping through the Father's Day ice cream social, we are truly living in a world that is a sleep epidemic, in other words. So this is a term coined by Participation that talks about the current status of our children's sleep. So how are we doing? In 2016, Participation released their report card that included a lot of different behaviors, but sleep was one of them. And we got a B for sleep. So not bad, but not great either. But what led to this grade? So how are Canadian kids doing when it comes to sleep? Well, approximately a third of school-aged kids, and this is ages 10 to 13 years, and over a quarter of adolescents aged 14 to 17 years are sleep deprived. And school-aged children and youth over time are sleeping less than they used to. In fact, this is supported by recent evidence that has come out of the Compass Group that looked at sleep duration over time using the Compass study, and this included 3 different ways of data collection, 2013, 2014, then to 2015 and 2016. And the authors reported that average sleep durations declined over the study waves, resulting in less than half the youth meeting the guidelines of 8 to 10 hours per night. So why has this secular decline happened? Why are kids sleeping less? So many would argue that it's the modern way of life combined with our perceptions of sleep and our value on sleep. So we all absolutely want the best for our children, I know that, but as a society we live in a world where we have overprogrammed kids are the norm, and it's rare to just open the doors and say, hey, go out and play, just go be a child. Our perfectionist adult nature has led to our perceptions that sleep is a waste of time, and that our children need an edge to succeed by being programmed, and that just free play in itself has many ways gone away. And because of this, sleep is not necessarily prioritized in the home, and we have a lack of bedtime routines that are happening. I'll give an example of this. In our neighborhood community, there's community league soccer for preschool children ages 2 to 5. It starts at 6:30 and goes till 7:30, which goes into bedtime. And that means that you might be able to leave at 7:30 if you can convince the 4-year-old that they don't get to play at the park with their friends afterwards. So how do you make that happen? It's nearly impossible. It means that my husband or I, one of us have to leave work. We have to pick our children up from daycare. We then have to get them home, feed them, get them changed, and get to the park for a 6:30 soccer. And that might not even including walking the 3 blocks to get to soccer. Consider that active transport to do physical activity. So it takes a modern miracle to deal with our modern way of life, and because of it, in many ways, our children are suffering. So if you don't believe me that times have changed in terms of parenting, here are 2 more images. So because we've engineered the play out of our children's lives, what is the modern day program-loving parent to do when it comes to wanting their child to get physical activity? Well, slap your toddler on a piece of pint-sized exercise equipment and get them moving. So there's one solution. And then, hey, you don't have to worry about getting to the park for soccer. The picture on the right is a baby chair. Now, I realize that I just got myself out of the baby trenches, but this baby chair is for babies aged 0 to 6 months. And while you might think that's a mirror, that's actually to hold an iPad. So now you have the toddler exercising and you have the baby watching who knows what. So maybe you could sleep, but probably not exactly what's going to happen. So here is just an example of how our modern society has changed. So why do we care? And maybe this isn't actually that big of a deal. Maybe why do we care about sleep? Maybe it's not a big deal. Why do we care that our kids aren't sleeping that much? Well, it turns out we should care, and it turns out that there are issues that we need to look at. In fact, as part of the release of the 24-hour movement guidelines, which I'll tell you about in a minute or two, there was a series of systematic reviews released on this topic area. And this recent systematic review looked at the relationship between sleep duration and health indicators of school-aged children and youth. And these were apparently healthy school-aged children and youth. So this wasn't for clinical populations such as kids with obstructive sleep apnea or insomnia. And the authors found that overall, longer sleep duration was associated with lower adiposity indicators, better emotional regulation, better academic achievement, and better overall quality of life and well-being. And in conclusion, they said that shorter sleep duration is associated with adverse physical and mental health outcomes. So this is overall. We can take a look at another specific study that came out of the School of Public Health. So Dr. Paul Buglers and Noma Dubé, who's a PhD student in the school, looked specifically at the use of entertainment and communication devices before sleep. And what the authors found was that the odds of obesity doubled with bedroom access to and use of a TV or computer the hour before bed, and having access to devices was associated with increased obesity despite reading frequently the hour before bed. And what I also found most interesting was that whether devices were used or not in the hour before sleep, just having access to them in the bedroom was associated with less sleep quality. There was also another recent study that came out specifically. So I mentioned the Instagram culture. So if we want to look specifically at social media, Dr. Chaput's lab, as part of the HALO group in Ontario, looked at some of just social media use amongst youth. And they examined the association between social media and sleep duration of 5,000 kids that took part in the Ontario Student Drug and Health Survey. And what the authors found was that the greater use of social media was associated with shorter sleep duration in a dose-response fashion. Now, the authors themselves indicated that the mechanisms, it's unclear. Perhaps it's displacement of sleep, perhaps it's blue light. But what I want to tie to you now, and getting into the concept of schools, is that think about, maybe not all of you, there's some younger people in the room, think about when you were in school, and if you had a bad day at school, and you went home, and you got to just unplug from that bad day. Perhaps you talked to friends or families, friends or family, but you just got to go home and say, I had a bad day at school. Think about youth today, if they have a bad day at school, or even if they have a good day. The presence alone of that device, the thought of either waiting for a negative post or waiting for a positive post, would be very disruptive and very stressful, I can imagine. So imagine if you're being bullied. It doesn't stop the moment you leave school. Imagine if you have a new relationship. That doesn't stop the moment you leave school, right? So just the presence alone, perhaps that's one of the reasons. So I've talked about screens, but what about nutrition? So out of the same group, nutrition doesn't get off easily. So out of the same group, they looked at sleep duration and consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages and energy drinks were linked. So amongst middle and high school students, led to increased energy drinks and increased sugar-sweetened beverage drinks in high schools or middle schools. So why is this? So perhaps because kids are sleep deprived, they think that they need to consume these drinks to stay awake, either because they think the sugar or the caffeine will help them, or they drink these drinks to stay up later. So you can see here how all of these different associations are linked. So I've presented a number of reasons why we should care, that shorter sleep duration leads to a number of less desirable health outcomes. But what does this look like from a big picture? Well, it's a vicious cycle. And we could spend all day trying to figure out where arrows could or should go, but we're not going to, because it is a vicious cycle and they're all interrelated. So for example, perhaps decreased sleep duration and sleep quality is associated with decreased physical activity. Perhaps kids are too tired to move. Or maybe decreased sleep duration and sleep quality is associated with unhealthy food choices. So maybe we have more time to eat those unhealthy foods, or maybe we're looking at some of the homeostatic feeding behaviors and hormones such as leptin and ghrelin. And that all relates to unhealthy body weights. Perhaps decreased sleep duration and sleep quality is independently associated with unhealthy body weight, which one study showed, and then just recently last week another study was released that didn't necessarily show that. So instead of going through and placing arrows all throughout here, and I should say NOMA used a variation of this slide, and it did have arrows in, but I'm not an epidemiologist, so right now I'm going to apologize to the epidemiologists in the room, and this is how I see the vicious cycle. So I'm not suggesting that the work that's being done to untangle all of these relationships isn't important. It absolutely is 100% important. But when these behaviors interact, it does paint a different picture. And we need to acknowledge that the behaviors do interact. So again, apologies to the epidemiologist. So at this point in the talk, what I hope that I have gotten across is that kids aren't sleeping enough. And this could be potentially due to a no sleepygenic environment. I don't know, I was trying to come up with a term instead of obesogenic environment, but a no sleepygenic environment. And that we should care because of all the myriad health consequences, both physical, mental health, as well as academic achievement, which I'll get into. So what can we do given the complexity of the situation and the interplay between all of these relationships? Well, one thing that has been done is acknowledging that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so on June 16th, 2016, and I remember that date because it's my daughter's birthday, the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines for children and youth were released. And these were the first such guidelines in the world which recognize the interconnectedness of the movement continuum. There were guidelines released just recently for the early years of ages 0 to 4, but I'm just focusing on the children and youth aged 5 to 17 years. So what these recommendations show is that it's not enough to simply provide, say, the moderate to vigorous physical activity, the sedentary behavior, and the sleep guidelines independently. We need to recognize that they're interconnected, and in fact, promoting them separately could cause harm. You can see here that there are sleep recommendations, and while sleep does absolutely vary from one person to another in terms of the optimal amount due to biology, this is a huge step in terms of public health, in terms of providing recommendations from a policy level, from an intervention level. And while these do mention quantity and a little bit about quality, we also have to recognize that quality is important, as well as timing, consistency, and continuity. So if this doesn't get you going in terms of the guidelines, here's another way of looking at it. So if we want to look at the 24-hour movement guidelines and recognize that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, it's not enough to rationalize that just because I got my 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, perhaps at the gym, that I can be sedentary the rest of the day, and I don't have to sleep well. The new 24-hour movement guidelines recognize this interconnectedness and recognize that we need to think along the lines of whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So how are Canadian children doing when it comes to these new guidelines? Well, not great. So only 17.5% of children and youth are meeting the recommendations. So if looking at meeting the recommendations, if there's only 17.5%, what can we do given this complexity? We need to take a population health approach. And if we consider this seminal article from Jeffrey Rose, we can look at what that means. So instead of asking why did this individual get this disease at this time, we can ask why do some populations have so much disease whilst others it's rare. So you can see a large number of people at a small risk may give rise to more cases of disease than the small number who are at a high risk. So instead of focusing on the high risk, we can focus on a population level approach, which would target those that wouldn't necessarily be in that. And this is echoed by a recent systematic review that said that interventions are needed to stimulate the general population of children to obtain healthy sleep. So what can we do? It takes a village. It takes a village to deal with this if we want to take a population health approach. And if we look at the ecological model, this is one way of recognizing the individual lives within the context of their environment. So while there are lots of great studies out there, and I know that there is a multi-site study, the child study, and Dr. Mondani here in Edmonton is looking at a sleep study that's looking more specifically in some of the clinical populations. So we absolutely need different level populations, or different approaches at different levels. But I think that we would all agree as parents, as educators, as scientists, as practitioners, that this is no longer just a problem of few, and we need to look at how we can address this more broadly. And in fact, Dr. Guy Faulkner's work that came out of part of the release of the 24-hour movement guidelines looked at perceptions of individuals in terms of how one would implement these guidelines. And what came out of the stakeholder consultations with over 100 individuals in focus groups was that we needed to take a multi-sectoral, multi-level approach in which we addressed policies, environments, social norms, and also different strategies. As well, Dr. Amy Latimer Chung looked at what else we can do in terms of the implications and said that schools are a key place in which we can promote healthy sleep amongst kids, but there's not much work being done, and it's difficult to figure out what that looks like. So I've gotten to schools. Schools are part of the village. I hope I've sold you on that. And it's much easier in terms of schools. If we want to look at schools being part of the village, why would schools be part of the village? It's much easier to establish healthy behaviors in early childhood and adolescence than to try to change behaviors later down the road. But if you are working in schools and if you're an educator, schools often say to me, Kate, we're going to add something else to our plate. Why are we going to do this? Now, teachers also want the best for their children, but we have to make sure that it's not just an add-on. So here's the other rationale. Healthy kids learn better, and this is key. For a long time, we've recognized that fed kids learn better, that physically active kids learn better, that kids who don't sit too long learn better. But I challenge you to talk to any teacher that has a bunch of sleepy kids in their class, how easy it is to teach a sleepy child, or how easy it is to get a sleepy child to move. It's nearly impossible. In fact, it's quite disruptive. And when a statistic says that 60 to 70% of Canadian children or students are often very sleepy during their morning class, you can see why I was getting the feedback as a school health expert working in schools. So what are some solutions? So I'm going to show you one possibility first. So our sleep pods are solutions. So while personally I think having a sleep pod might be great, I don't think they are our solution. So this is really just a Band-Aid approach to having a lot of really tired kids in schools, allowing them to sleep in schools. So see, we did get there. Kids are actually sleeping in schools. And I know I work with a lot of schools across Canada. $14,000 for one Sometimes we can barely get funding to get a refrigerator in a school so that they can serve healthy food. So this is a Band-Aid solution. It's maybe not our best solution. I'm not saying that it's a no. I'm just saying that it's a possibility. So what are some solutions given this complexity, and what are some more upstream approaches? So I have 3 potential solutions. The first is to delay start times in middle and high schools. So the American Academy of Pediatrics released a policy statement in 2014 that recommended that middle and high schools start no earlier than 8:30 in the morning. There currently aren't Canadian recommendations, but why would we even do this? So this is generally supported in the literature. Kids are less sleepy, kids tend to do better in class, and they have less depressive symptoms. So when we're looking at adolescence, what you have to remember is that while we have our own perceptions in society about adolescence, their natural circadian rhythms are different than us as adults and different than younger kids. So their body naturally wants them to go to bed a little bit later, which means they want them to wake up a little bit later. So what happens is that during the week, adolescents aren't necessarily getting as much sleep as they are, and they try to catch up on the weekend, which goes against the recent recommendations of having consistent bed and wake times throughout the week. So while the US start times, and a lot of the research that's come out of delayed start times is from the US, so while the average start times in many American schools is around 8 a.m., and the average start time in Canada might be about 8:45, and this is from a study with the health behavior in school-aged children, there's still room for improvement, and there's still Canadian evidence that suggests that this might be a good idea. So you can see here again one study from the Compass group that looked at Alberta and Ontario youth, and they looked at the hours between 8 to 9:30 a.m., and for each hour delay in start time, that equated to an additional 7 minutes of sleep. The other study was from the health behavior in school-aged children, and they looked at a start time of 9:30 versus 8:30 a.m., in which students got an average of 19 more minutes of sleep. So I was talking to a colleague about this and how many minutes is relevant. Well, if you add those up over the week, it does become very relevant. And then if you ask my school health colleagues, you make this sound like a simple solution. I'm not going to stand up here and say that this is an easy solution at all. In fact, it's quite a difficult situation. You've got busing, you have human resources, you have block schedules, you have looking at the whole school jurisdiction, you have looking at the province, you have looking at the interconnectedness of all of that. It would be very challenging, but just because something's challenging doesn't mean we shouldn't have a conversation about it. So that is my first recommendation. My second recommendation is that we need to create a school culture that values sleep. So how do we do that? A framework that I use in my work to implement creating healthy school communities is called comprehensive school health. Comprehensive school health recognizes the interplay, or the fact that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, between policies, environments, partnerships and services, and of course, teaching and learning. The framework's based on the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion, for those of you that want to look it up, and it really is an approach that supports improving student educational outcomes while addressing school health in a planned, integrated, and holistic way. What comprehensive school health is meant to do is to truly shift a school culture to one that creates a healthy school community. So in looking at that and in looking how this relates to sleep, I want to first describe what do I mean by shifting a school culture. Because this is often, when I tell people what I do, they say, oh, that's great, you go into nutrition classes and you tell kids what to eat, you make them run around and you might talk about sleep. And that's not the case. While curriculum is part of it and while teaching and learning is part of it, it's just one small piece of the puzzle. So here's an illustration. I want you to imagine that you're walking into a French immersion school. What would be the first thing that you would see? You would see and you would hear French. But the reality of a French immersion school culture is that you don't just see and hear it, you also taste, touch, and smell it. You're truly shifting the school culture. And that's illustrated by what Alberta Education says in terms of what their goal is with French immersion. So here's one example that I always get from my family in talking about a French immersion culture when my husband was growing up in St. Albert. Tourtière was introduced. Canadian food, French Canadian food, school culture. You can truly hear, see, taste, touch, and smell the culture of that school. It should be no different than when you're walking into a healthy school. And I'm not talking about a bunch of kids that are running around so much that you can smell the children. What I'm talking is that it should reach every aspect of what that school does. When you walk into that school, it should have an essence of health, not just seeing it and hearing it in health curriculum. So if we're looking at that from the context of sleep, it means that sleep can't just be taught in health curriculum. It has to be embedded in everything that we do. So what does that mean? Well, in math class, why wouldn't you graph the hours of sleep? That's just one example. Maybe do jumping jacks with the number of hours of sleep. The other thing that creating a culture that supports healthy sleep habits in school or that promotes sleep is the language and the role modeling that is used. Language sets the tone in school communities. So when teachers are walking around in hallways, staff are walking around in hallways, the administrator and the students, and we have a culture that doesn't value sleep and instead says, I am so tired, I'm so sleep deprived, I only got 4 hours of sleep and you're bragging about it. We need to change that talk. We need to create a culture in a school that values sleep in the hallways. And we need to ensure that sleep is linked to other health behaviors. So if we're going to walk the walk and talk the talk, then kids need to get outside when they can. We need to understand that there is a 24-hour period of time in the day and that the movement, all of the movement behaviors are linked. So get kids out of their seats, moving with light, eating well, and perhaps they'll sleep better. So that's one example of what schools can do. If we want to create a culture that values sleep, we can also look at more upstream interventions. And here's an example of an upstream approach that has come out of Everactive Schools, who's a provincial partner that looks at supporting healthy school communities, as well as University of Calgary, and specifically Dr. Shelley Russell Mayhew, who's looking at mandatory pre-service teacher education on comprehensive school health. What an amazing thing that is, when teachers go into schools and already have a value and an understanding of what it means to create a healthy school community. This is now expanding across Alberta with the University of Alberta with Dr. Doug Gleddy and Dr. Loren Souls, as well as across Canada. And in conversations with Brian over the last week, he promises me that sleep could potentially get integrated into this curriculum. The other thing we can do for more upstream approaches is when we're designing schools and classrooms, don't design them like ones like this. We can apply the principles of architectural daylighting. So I know that I've taught in classes like this. It feels like a little bit of life is drained out of you at times. So it's amazing what happens when we have windows and we have light, especially in Edmonton, where I often said it's night all day. So if you don't believe me, here's a quote from a school principal from one study that we did where he said, or she said, I truly believe that I have to walk the talk. Kids won't listen to what they see, to what we say, they'll listen to what they see us doing. So I know I'm talking about language, but I'm not just talking about language. I'm talking about creating a culture in which students are seeing this practice. They're seeing this healthy talk role modeled. So that was my second thing that we can do. What's my third thing we can do? We need to acknowledge students as change agents. We need to acknowledge that they can do this in terms of technology, in terms of bedtime routine, and in terms of the home environment. So research has shown that children can actually play a pivotal role in catalyzing change in the home. So recent work that my team did looked at a secondary analysis of qualitative data from over 10 years, almost 10 years of different, 5 different studies, 125 interviews. And what we found was that students are actually change agents and are driving change in the home. They're facilitating behavior change in the home. Students are taking that information they learned at school and changing what they're doing. This study came out of work that we did with Apple Schools as well as Healthy School, Healthy Futures, but as my postdoc sitting in the back, she's been on a Essential Conditions roadshow over the last year in which we're working to test these essential conditions in different contexts and settings. And so through interviews with over 50 stakeholders in every province and territory, yes, with government, with health, with education, with teachers, with a whole host of different stakeholders, we have heard that these conditions align in different settings. So kids can create change. This also aligns with work more locally through the Alberta Healthy School Community Wellness Fund, who currently has 98 projects to help create healthy school communities, 53 at the district level and 45 at the school level. And in talking with the Wellness Fund, they said that several of their high school projects based on feedback are saying that what the students want to hear more about is sleep. Now, the Wellness Fund doesn't have any current projects that are funded to address sleep specifically other than the movement guidelines, but it is emerging. So what I'm saying here is that students are interested in this topic and they are change agents when it comes to creating healthy school communities. And when I say healthy school communities, again, I mean the home, the school, and the community. Now, this isn't new. This concept is not new. So I'm personally a child of the 70s and 80s, and while Generation Xers like to think that we're slightly different than maybe Generation Z or Z, or Generation Change, we have a lot of similarities. When I was growing up, back in the day, reduce, reuse, recycle was something that was taught at school. We then took that message home and we changed both the physical and the social environment of our home. We were the ones that asked to have the bins placed, and we were the ones that supported the recycling. Seatbelt use was another example. Seatbelts weren't as common and as practiced as they are today, and so children took that message home. Another message was tobacco cessation. I often tell the story that it was one of my parents' birthday parties, and my best friend had me on smoking watch of her mother, because her mother had quit smoking, so to speak, but my friend didn't believe her. So we were the ones learning about all of that at school and, in a sense, policing it in the home. So this isn't new. This is not a new message. So if we look at the recommendations and the general tips for having a healthy sleep hygiene, how can we put these in place in schools? So what are some of the possibilities? Here's one example that comes from Apple Schools, an exemplar comprehensive school health project that is in Alberta at this point. And they created a Be a Sleep Star campaign in response to hearing that their kids are tired. So they work with kids to get the technology out of the bedroom, to establish a healthy and calming bedtime routine that includes reading, listening to music, bathing, not using the screens, facilitating change in the home environment to make sure that the bedroom is quiet, cool, comfortable, dark, and to link with the other health behaviors. And you can see here examples of bulletin boards, class announcements, as well as a newsletter, and this is all available on their website. Another example from the School of Public Health, and Dr. Paul Vuglers is leading this, again with Noma, who's a PhD student, is the Parkland Sleep Study, which is a trial to look at how school-learned health promotion is translating to changes in behaviors in the home. And you can see here some of the resources in terms of lesson plans, home booklets, announcements, websites, home modifications, and checklists. So much like this art installation by Patrick Cruz, I've only presented a few options. There are others in the province that are starting to do work in the area of school-based sleep promotion. So I've mentioned partners such as Everactive Schools, the Wellness Fund, Alberta Health Services and the work that they're doing with the health promotion coordinators, many different government ministries, Be Fit for Life, the Alberta School Board Employee Benefit Plan, and others, including, I know, even the Alberta Teachers Association has a Growing Up Digital project. So there are lots of different examples, and just what I presented today are some small pieces of the bigger picture painting. So what am I personally doing in terms of this area? And I know Jeff alluded to this at the beginning, but the work that I am doing through my CHR New Investigator grant is to look at specifically the student perceptions as well as the parent perceptions, because we know that we can't physically role model sleeping in school. So the link between the home and the school is very important. So we're studying this by looking at student perceptions through a data generating strategy called Photo Voice, in which kids are depicting the everyday lived realities. We also want to do interviews with parents to understand how they value sleep, what their perceptions of sleep are, and if what the kids are learning is being role modeled in the home. And lastly, we're going to take findings from those first two stages and have extensive stakeholder consultation through focus groups and roundtables to ensure that the way in which schools are integrating some of these guidelines from Participation and others are aligned with what school communities would like to do. So this is just one example of how we can potentially shift school culture to promote sleep. Now, we're still very much in the early days of sleep promotion at school. So much like climbing this mountain, we're on the path. We still have a long ways to go, perhaps some steep climbs, and this isn't going to be a sprint in no means. So given the complexity and the huge implications of sleep, we need to think and recognize schools and people like me, albeit 20 years younger and much more well-rested, that we are unusual suspects for sleep promotion. And as Casey knows, we were trying to put together a picture with my lab group, but anyways, had to use the 20-year-old photo here to talk about unusual suspects. We are all part of the village, and we can all be part of the solution in looking at how we promote sleep in schools. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to leave you with these two quotes. And these are from 2 grade 5 students. And 1 grade 5 student said, sleeping is a healthy thing to do, and it's healthy because you need to sleep to be able to go through your day at school. And another child said, if you don't get your rest, and if you don't learn, you won't have a good grade, and you won't go to the next grade, like in junior high and high school. So be a rebel, resist the culture of being tired. Instead, we need to create a culture that values and supports sleep. So make time for sleep, be a role model, speak positively about sleep to yourself, to your children, to others, and recognize the usual suspects when it comes to sleep promotion. We need to really recreate the village. So now go home, get some rest. I think people are tired, and recharge your own batteries, not just your iPhone. So thank you very much. And questions?
Thanks very much, Kate, for enlightening and enlivening, keeping everybody awake.
Mostly.
For your talk. We've got a few minutes now that Kate will be able to take some questions, whether you're here with us today or online. If you're joining us at a distance, questions can be typed into the chat box, and we'll monitor those. If you're here, have questions here in the audience, just raise a hand, and we've got a microphone that will travel around the room to capture your questions. So I'll open the floor to any questions for Kate.
Hello. I'm a very practical person and also a mother of a 7-year-old. So what would be your suggestions for a good sleep strategy, a good sleep routine at night?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, so 7-year-old, and we like to think often that technology isn't part of that, but I would say that looking at lots of the evidence, I would say technology is a first step. So unplugging long before sleep. Oh, yes, sorry, there's camera. I have a tendency to wander, so I was told I had to stay here. So unplugging a few hours before bed is always a great idea. That's the first thing. Having consistency in time. So I know with busy schedules, and I know we have a nearly 5-year-old, so I'm not at the 7-year-old level yet, and I know that there are programs, but it's making a conscious decision about that and trying to stay consistent through the week and the weekend. So I mentioned the soccer program at 6:30. You have to think about as a family how that is going to impact you, if that's something that you can work in and that your child can deal with. And some children can deal with those disruptions better than others. And then just having consistency in bedtime routines, so looking at how you can have calming bedtime practices as opposed to kind of energized bedtime practices. So, reading or listening to calm music, not, a big dance party perhaps in the house. And whatever relaxes your child. Bathing, for example, might also be another example. And then really looking at the environment in the bedroom. So as we move into summer, looking at how bright it might be, because it is very disruptive. And is it cool enough in the room? Is it quiet enough? Is it dark enough? Is it comfortable? So looking at the bed, where the bed is placed. And if you have, I know our house is very echoey, so things like white noise machines can also be very helpful. So consistency, and it's hard, I get it. We have 2 little kids, and sometimes it just feels like, if you start too late, you're never going to get there, and if you're late from work, then it just spirals out of control. So I would say try to set aside a few weeks where you can try to really make it a priority and see if the habits kind of come into play. That's partially as knowing the evidence, but that's also as a mother, I hear you. So, yes.
Any other questions? Is there any online?
Thank you for a great presentation, Kate. Just wondering, when we are in schools, working with schools with NSTEP, at the junior high level, we're talking about
NSTEP, of course. You guys are doing work too. Sorry.
Teen brain, teen mind. And so you didn't mention much about the neuroscience, but it's really like for those junior high kids, understanding that, that they need it takes 3 days of sleep, consistent sleep to learn something is really powerful. And the other thing is, one of our principals, and she tells a story of when she has, this is at the elementary level, when she has a meeting with families that have problems with their children. The very first question she asks them is, what time do your children go to bed? And, she's, well, 9 o'clock, then they're like 7 and 8. She's going, well, let's start there.
Yeah.
And really, it doesn't even need to go beyond that, because that's really where the problem starts. So great presentation, thank you.
And thanks for those notes, absolutely, very important points. And I think that, it's difficult to say, absolutely, the principle's fine, start here, start with the sleep. Looking at all the different health behaviors, obviously we know that they're all interlinked as well. And so I think that that's the beauty of working in schools, where we don't have to pick and choose necessarily what health behaviors we promote, because if it's just embedded in culture that sleep and physical activity and nutrition and mental health is all part of it, then that's just how kids grow up. So yeah, absolutely, thank you.
Thanks, Kate, for a great presentation. Lane and I were laughing because when you had the word twired,
Yeah.
we felt that really described how we feel most of the time.
Yeah.
So thanks for a new word. Now, my question is, I'm curious to know if there's an interplay between sleep habits or sleep behavior and culture.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I suspect that children who may have difficulty unplugging at night, or their sleep behavior at home, could be a result of other factors in the home, whether it's household chores or the responsibilities that they may have in the house as a way of supporting the family or whatnot.
Absolutely. So, if we look at adults, if we have a variety of different stressors that make it difficult, you think back to the slide of the picture of all of the different what you'd be stimulated by in your everyday reality, and then the one that's kind of calm in nature. That's very much how, as adults, we think about kids and jobs and busy lives. That extends absolutely to children as well. And while I don't know that people have specifically studied kind of the interplay between what kids' responsibilities are from a cultural standpoint, certainly mental health is linked with sleep. And if you have more responsibilities in the home, or if there are other cultural components that come into play, it absolutely would affect it. If you even just look at thinking of technology and the presence of a device, or thinking about the stress of having, someone bullying you, well, that can be applied to just stress overall. If you're worried about getting enough food, perhaps, if you're worried about caring for your siblings, or if you're worried about all of the other things that you have to do, it's pretty tough to fall asleep. So, yeah, good question. Thank you.
Are there any other questions here? I'll check one more time if there's anything online. No? Yes, at the back. Isa.
Hi. So this is purely anecdotal, but it raised a good point. I was doing some data collection at a school, and we happened to talk about school culture, and the principal said, well, it's not just at the school level, it's at the district level, because they are in charge of shifting, a principal from one school to the next, so that school culture can be smooth and then immediately disrupted at the board level. So I'm just wondering how you go about making that change at the school level, but then ensuring it's still intact, or like the school district values that as well.
Absolutely. So this, in the world of school health, the conversation of district and school level, working at the district or school level has come up. The reality is that you have to work at both levels, because if the district isn't supportive of, say, a policy or program, it's very difficult for the administrators to make time in both, from a time perspective as well as from a resource perspective. So schools have school improvement plans. So how do you work that in if your district isn't supportive? But the flip side is, it's both. So one way to deal with it is that what work from one of my graduate students did was she looked at the role of the principals in implementing comprehensive school health. And so one thing that came out of that was that the principals needed to not only prime for the cultural shift, meaning that they needed to understand what, say, comprehensive school health was, but they also needed to prime themselves in terms of that cultural shift so that they could be role models and advocates. And based upon that, and this was work that we did with Apple Schools, is that we started having conversations with school jurisdictions saying that, okay, if we're going to have a principal for 3 years, how can we make this a positive change if the administrator changes? So that when you're hiring a new principal, you say, this is a healthy school. Are you on board with that? So a lot of schools have already changed staff hiring practices in terms of teachers. So much like you would go into an interview for a teacher and you say, this is a school that promotes technology. Are you on board with that? You're probably just going to say yes so that you get the job and you'll figure it out at the end of the day. So we would do that with healthy schools. This is a healthy school. Do you know that? So that then the school health champion doesn't have to march down the hall and say we don't use can-do as rewards or we have positive talk about sleep. So you can change hiring practices, and that in that way it can actually become a benefit in that if you have a principal that's been part of a healthy school community and they move to a new school where it's not necessarily a priority yet, they can take that message there. They've already been personally primed for the cultural shift. They just need to get to know their staff as well as the school community and then can take that change. So it actually can be a benefit as opposed to a detriment. So from an asset-based approach. But good question. It is an issue. Yeah.
I think we have a question online.
Hi, Kate. This question comes from the Calgary Viewing Party. So this would be our alumni and students in the Calgary area. They would like to know, do you know why school start times start when they do? Has there been a change over time that school times have gradually started earlier? And what's the rationale for starting so early?
Ooh, there's a lot of there. So, so the reality is that school start times vary between schools, even within districts. A lot of it has to do with busing and scheduling. So in terms of start times, and looking at over time, I don't know what has, I think that there are a number of schools that have added on, say, for example, one high school in our neighborhood added on an early block. And I go back to the perspective of gaining an edge, or where people feel like their children need to have an edge and they need to take an additional course. They need to take summer school in order to get better entrance tests, to get scholarships, to get into university. And so I think we've started adding on things, and I think that's why in some places that the start times have shifted. I think busing has become a challenge, and I'm trying to think what else was part of that question. So have they shifted over time? I can't give conclusive evidence other than I know schools have started adding some of the earlier blocks for students that want to take additional courses. Rationale for why they start, logistics in many ways, but I think also keeping a consistent, you know, there is somewhat of a culture of we need to be done school at a certain time, and so if you need to add something, where are you going to add it? You can't really add it at 3:30 or 3.
I'll just ask one more. If anybody else has any other questions in the audience here? Well, if not, then we'll bring the talk to a close. It's for those online or in the audience, just to make you aware, as you know, the lecture has been recorded. It will be available for additional viewing. It will be available on the school's website starting tomorrow. So if you want to come back. Remind you again, the evaluation forms that are available, just to encourage you to take a moment to fill out the evaluation forms and give us any feedback. They'll be available just at the door. You can drop them off at the table just outside the door. And as you leave, I'd just like to invite you to join us. Continue the conversation. If you have more questions, Kate will be around for a little bit, but there's light refreshments outside in the foyer, just outside the doors as well. So with that, just once again, thanks, Kate, for the lecture. I hope everyone has a good evening and, of course, a good sleep.
Thank you.